Hello, everyone, and welcome for joining our workshop today. It's fantastic to see so many dedicated educators here. Your commitment to educating the next generation on U.S.-China relations is crucial. For the past 3 decades, the 1990 Institute has worked hard to foster better relations between U.S. and China. In more recent years, to champion equitable treatment for Asian Americans. Today, we're here to help you and your students to navigate the complexity of U.S.-China relations by going beyond headlines to understanding the real policy at play. We would also like to acknowledge our appreciation to our co-sponsors here. What makes our workshop unique is our focus. In addition to providing you with knowledge, we also provide practical resources and support for your teaching and general knowledge. Our newsletter, reference library, and teachers portal are filled with current information and classroom material tailored to your needs. Throughout this workshop, we'll explore issues that make China important to you and the world in areas such as trade conflicts, technology disputes, Taiwan, and student exchanges. We'll also tackle broader questions like what are America's strategic goals in this relationship with China? How do Americans' perspective differ from the global view? And can we realistically separate our economies? Foreign policy impact domestic decisions and American society. Here is our agenda for the workshop. Our expert speakers, Susan Thornton, a retired diplomat and senior fellow at Yale Law School, and Neysun Mahboubi, director of the Penn project on future of U.S.-China relations, will guide us through these discussions, separating enduring policies from long-term political rhetoric. Following their presentation, Sebastian Cherng, Vice Dean and Associate Professor of International Education at NYU, will moderate a discussion to dive deeper into these topics and address your questions. Please put your questions in the bottom of the Q&A section. Thank you all for being here and for your dedication to nurturing critical thinking and global awareness among our students. This workshop marks just the beginning of our support for you. Let's begin and make today an enriching experience for all. Susan, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about America's relationship with China and to help put in a policy context some of the rhetoric that's out there in both the media and on the campaign trail. The first question I want to talk about is, why does China matter? Why is China important to you, to America, and to the world? There's no relationship that will impact our collective future more than that between the U.S. and China. So it's key that our young people be able to understand and contextualize what they're hearing about it. China is the biggest country by population, along with India. Together, they make up almost 40% of the world population. And China alone makes up 1/5 of humanity. Now, things that affect 1/5 of humanity are definitely going to impact on all of us. China is the second largest economy in the world, after the U.S. It is approaching 1/5 of global output, whereas the U.S. produces 1/4 of global output. That's a lot of money. China makes a lot of the products that we buy. If you've been to Walmart or shopping anywhere lately, you know that a lot of things are made in China. It is the biggest manufacturer in the world. And China is also the biggest producer of food in the world. It is also the biggest importer, buying more food from others than any other country. China is a technology power with enormous research capacity and engineering prowess. Over the decades, the U.S. has attracted and trained, and in many cases retained, China's top innovation talents here in the U.S. China has the second biggest military in the world, and it is seen by several of its neighbors as a potential threat. We will talk about the issue of Taiwan in a bit more depth later, but it is possible that the US and China could come into military conflict over this issue. China has frequently been the source of epidemics, given the large numbers of people and animals that both cohabitate inside China. And COVID-19, of course, is only the latest example of that. China is also the biggest polluter. China emits more greenhouse gases than any other country, so it is key to stopping climate change. Of course, along with India, Brazil, and developed countries like the US, who also need to do our part. But China is key. And there are many more ways in which China is important to us. I've only just touched on a few, but hopefully that will give your students some inkling that they should learn something about this very large and important country on the other side of the world. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is what is the state of U.S.-China relations today and how did we get here? And here I want to go through a bit of the history between the United States and China, because many of the themes that are present in the history of these two countries' relations still resonate today, and they are important for understanding the lingering tensions and problems in the relationship. America's relationship with China goes back almost to the beginning of America, and things have always been complicated. The United States from early days sought to trade with China, and its missionaries sought to proselytize in China. The US took concessions when colonial powers took pieces of the Chinese coast as trading outposts in the 19th century. And at the same time, American missionaries set up schools and hospitals and taught in China throughout that century. And around the same time, Chinese laborers came to the United States by the thousands to help build our national railroad system. And their presence in the United States led to an early wave of anti-immigration sentiment in the United States. There were fears of the so-called yellow peril. And these fears were whipped up to such an extent that they were followed by the passage of the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration from 1882 all the way up until the Second World War. Now, China and the US were allies in both world wars, but after World War II, China's civil war brought the Chinese Communist Party to power under Mao Zedong in 1949. And the government that had been in power in China under Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island of Taiwan, which is about 100 miles off the coast of China. And there, Taiwan fell under the protection of the United States. The US and China were then estranged for the next 20 years or so, as the US and its allies pursued a policy of containing communism during the early part of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The US involvement in Vietnam's civil war followed directly from this containment policy, and as that war dragged on and became unpopular, Richard Nixon, president in the US at the time, pursued rapprochement with China. He did this for several reasons. One was to try to stop the Vietnam War, which in that case, the Chinese were supporting the North Vietnamese. He wanted to enlist China in his struggle against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, because China and the Soviet Union were having rocky relations at that time. And he wanted to try also to bring China into the global community. And he expressed famously in his Foreign Affairs article about this that he didn't think China should be left outside of the global community in isolation to nurse her fears there. So Nixon did pursue this opening to China in the early 1970s, and it did work. The Chinese were enlisted in the U.S. efforts against the Soviet Union. After Mao Zedong died in 1976, a new Chinese leader came on the scene, Deng Xiaoping, and he launched a reform program called Reform and Opening to try to modernize and reform China's economy. At the same time, the U.S. and China managed in 1979 to normalize their diplomatic relations. In the process of doing that, the U.S. and China put into place the current arrangements by which the U.S. basically protects Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, while at the same time, the U.S. does not officially recognize Taiwan as an independent country. That's a shortcut way of encapsulating the U.S.'s one China policy on Taiwan, and we can get into it in more detail later. But that's the basic outline. So to some extent, the Chinese Civil War still persists to this day, even though the Chinese Communist Party defeated Chiang Kai-shek's government and took over as the government of China proper 75 years ago. So we'll come back to this issue in a minute, but it's important to keep in mind that history. There are two subsequent events that brought us really to where we are today in U.S.-China relations. The most important of these, I think, was the collapse of the Soviet Union that ended this bipolar world order that we knew during the Cold War and ended the ideological struggle that the U.S. had undertaken with communism to that point. And in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, and in the wake of the Chinese suppression of its own protest movement and uprising at Tiananmen Square in 1989, in the wake of those two events, the U.S. and China found common cause in joint pursuit of Chinese modernization under the banner of reform and opening in China. So at that point, this was in the 1990s now, the U.S. and other Western businesses rushed in to invest and to help to build up China's economy. China became a hub of labor-intensive manufacturing for the globe, and certainly became a new export-oriented growth tiger in the Asia-Pacific region. China's GDP per capita at this point rocketed up from about $165 per person in China in 1978 to almost $13,000 today. That puts China almost into the reaches of a higher income country at $13,000 per capita GDP, which is quite a dramatic change. China has also managed in the last couple of decades to make a huge dent in alleviating poverty in China. And last year, I think it was, or the year before, China officially alleviated poverty within the borders of China, which was a major accomplishment. As part of this growth strategy that China was undertaking, it was able to accede to all of the international covenants governing the global economy, including the World Trade Organization in 2001. And that saw China's exports to the world really take off, causing trade imbalances with many countries, especially including the United States. And this so-called China shock is blamed for much of the deindustrialization of the U.S. heartland and the disappearance of manufacturing in this country in the 90s and especially in the 2000s after China got into the WTO. So problems in the relationship during this time, even though there were businesses in China and everybody was working toward this incredible growth story that China was undergoing, But these problems in the relationship, like tensions over Taiwan, disagreements over human rights violations, these problems all remain during this time, but they were managed for the sake of these larger objectives. And especially keep in mind during that time, the US was very much preoccupied with the post 9/11 global war on terror throughout the years of the 2000s, while this incredible growth story was happening in China. Now, after the 2008 financial crisis shook really the global economy, relations between the United States and China began to become more difficult to manage. China's relative rise in power at that point was becoming very obvious. The Obama administration was managing two very difficult wars, one in South Asia and Afghanistan, and one in the Middle East in Iraq. And China's foreign policy at that point became more assertive, especially in the Asia-Pacific region and also in international institutions, in terms of China trying to get more voice in the international system, but also in terms of outreach to other countries in the developing world. And the US, in response to this more assertive Chinese push, responded and began to beef up its military deterrence in the region. It seemed that China was openly challenging US leadership on the global stage and threatening several of its near neighbors in Asia, and the US was determined to respond and not allow China to move in such an aggressive way in the region. At the same time, foreign businesses were increasingly unhappy and feeling threatened by Chinese businesses and Chinese competitors who were helped along and also often given unfair advantage by China's statist economic policies. So on both the security side and the economic side, China was seen as being playing not by the rules, being assertive, and becoming threatening. There was a change of government in Taiwan in 2016, and of course, there was also a change of government in the United States in 2016. And the coincidence of those two changes set up a very fraught transition in U.S. China relations that got progressively more testy. Donald Trump on the campaign trail and subsequent to that had definitely put China in his crosshairs. He was very concerned about the trade imbalances with China. He labeled relations with China as a strategic competition, which was hearkening back to the Cold War competition and the containment strategies with the Soviet Union. And he imposed across-the-board tariffs of about 20% on Chinese imports to the United States in an effort to pressure China to negotiate a deal on trade. This all happened in about the period of 2017 and 2018, 2019. And then, of course, in early 2020, we had the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the advent of COVID, the U.S.-China relationship really took a downward spiral amid missteps, accusations. Millions of people died, millions more were sickened, the global economy tanked, and lives around the world were more severely disrupted than probably at any time in history. So that was a very tough period in U.S.-China relations. We can talk more about it during the question and answer period, but I continue to believe that this event in U.S.-China relations is probably the most salient and the most important in factoring into the serious deterioration in U.S.-China relations over the recent period. 4 years later on now from COVID-19, President Biden has largely continued President Trump's policy of strategic competition with China. That is having the effect of dividing the world into these two competing blocs. We're not sure exactly how far that is going to go. We're going to talk, I think, later in the program about this notion of decoupling of the economies, which are very much still complementary and entangled as we speak. The U.S. and Chinese presidents did agree as recently as last November in San Francisco when they met that a conflict between the U.S. and China is to be avoided. And so the current focus between the Biden administration and the administration in China of President Xi Jinping is overwhelmingly on trying to find stability in the relationship. Although it must be said that the focus remains on the problem areas and not as much on finding areas of cooperation as it has been in the past. Now, my colleague Neysun is going to talk about a number of the problem areas, but I would like to take up one of these problem areas here, which is the issue of Taiwan. And the last question I'll tackle in my time remaining is, why is Taiwan important and how could it cause a U.S.-China conflict? Now, as I mentioned, the issue of Taiwan's separation from mainland China is a major focus for China's foreign policy. And it's one that has been at the very center of U.S.-China relations since 1949 and was very delicately managed since the normalization of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China in 1979. Now, you hear a lot in the media now about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. You hear about a U.S. obligation to defend Taiwan and about the importance of shipping in the Taiwan Strait, about Taiwan's semiconductor industry and how important that is and how advanced it is, and about the importance of preserving peace and stability in and around Taiwan. And the reason you hear about all these things is because China has not forsworn the use of force, if needed, to prevent Taiwan from permanently separating from the mainland or from declaring itself as an independent country. And although the U.S. and China have many disagreements, I personally find it hard to imagine that any other issue between the two countries could lead to a military conflict between the two. But this issue, the Taiwan issue, is, in my view, the only one that could possibly lead to such a conflict. Now, that kind of a military conflict would be catastrophic given the nuclear capabilities of both the U.S. and China. It would certainly have terrible implications for Taiwan, of course, for the U.S. and China if it came to military blows, also, though, for Asia and for the entire globe. And so I think carefully managing the Taiwan issue has been a central focus of U.S. policymakers over the years, realizing this. And so far, the management of this issue since 1979 or even since 1949 has got to be declared a tremendous success. There has not been a military conflict over the Taiwan issue. So I think that this careful management of the Taiwan issue has allowed for the rise of all of Asia, certainly China, also especially Taiwan, which today is a wealthy, vibrant democracy. So I think we should think hard about what it takes to pursue that kind of careful management. Until recently, the approach to Taiwan has been to preserve the status quo. And you'll hear that comment a lot in official and media recounting on this issue. Effectively, the status quo is no independence for Taiwan and no forced unification by China. And that goes into the indefinite future. Now, this formula, of course, satisfies no one. And therefore, that's what makes it stable and durable as long as all sides agree to stick to the parameters. However, the reason why we're hearing more about it now is that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is thought to be more ambitious about reuniting Taiwan, and the advent of U.S. China competition is also changing the landscape. China has been losing patience with pro-independence politicians in Taiwan, and it views U.S. both political and military moves regarding Taiwan as somewhat alarming. Now, Xi Jinping has presumably set a deadline for China's great rejuvenation. That deadline was earlier declared to be 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But some people think the deadline for Taiwan's unification is earlier than that, maybe even in the next several years. And some in US military circles have stated they think there may be a timeline of 2027 or even earlier for Taiwan's forced reunification. So I think here it needs to be noted that Xi Jinping has reportedly told President Biden that he hasn't discussed such a deadline. And many experts do not agree with the alarmist timetables that sometimes appear in the media. Many people who study this issue believe that China still wishes to avoid a conflict and a forced unification and has a longer-term view. However, the US military needs to prepare for the worst-case scenario. So it needs to prepare for whatever the earliest possible timeline could be. And it has been assisting Taiwan in building up its deterrence and military capabilities. And this makes management of this issue more difficult and tension-filled than in the past. Now, the Biden administration has been working and making a point of trying to stabilize this situation with the Chinese government over the past year, and a high-level channel has been established to ensure that misunderstandings that could lead to escalation do not occur, and that is very important. If this issue is going to continue to be well managed, it must rely on continuous communication and constant diplomatic efforts to make sure that the two sides are talking and not misunderstanding one another. And I hope that that comes through when you're reading in the media and when you're talking with your students. The emphasis on dialogue and diplomacy cannot be overstated on this issue. And I'll end my presentation there and turn it over to my colleague, Neysun.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was fantastic. Next up will be Neysun Mahboubi, and he will be addressing some of the key issues that's been surrounding the headline news that's important to some of you. Off to you, Neysun.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be part of this conversation tonight, including with my good friend, Susan Thornton, for whom I have so much respect. So I thought I would build on Susan's wonderful presentation by going into some more detail on some additional issues beyond the Taiwan issue that she talked about, and some of the other issues that she talked about that have brought us to this particular point in U.S.-China relations and that are likely to be ventilated in some fashion in the coming election season. In each case, in each of the issues that I'm going to talk about in a moment, I want to be clear that there is plenty to be concerned about in terms of Chinese behavior. There are lots of things that China has done in recent years on each of these different sets of issues that I think we need to be very concerned about, and it makes sense that they are at the top of our political discussion and policy discussion in the United States. At the same time, I think there are also lots of questions about what is the best way, the most effective, the most wise way to address some of these challenges posed by Chinese behavior. In a perfect world, these coming campaigns would be very open to different kinds of perspectives and arguments about the best ways forward, but I'm enough of a realist to know that that may not exactly happen. But still, for this audience of educators and beyond them, your students, I hope it will be helpful to think in terms of a longer perspective on the issues that I'm going to lay out in a moment, and thinking about the real future of addressing these issues in broader terms than maybe we will see in the coming presidential campaigns. So the first issue I want to say something about is human rights. And I'm starting with this topic because the question of values has really been at the very core of the U.S.-China relationship since the beginning for well over 150 years. In her remarks, Susan mentioned the legacy of the early American missionaries. And if you go back and look at that history and the way in which their efforts and their challenges were discussed in American media, it's very clear that this question of, can China become more like what we in the United States would like to see from a standpoint of values, has been really a big point of contention for a very long time. Going a little bit forward in the timeline, it was also a major point of contention in the U.S. debates over the normalization of relations between the United States and China in the 1960s and 1970s. And this issue of human rights has taken on ever greater valence since the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989. I think when we look at this overall history and the way in which human rights has been part of the conversation of U.S. policy towards China, I think it's fair to say that, at least from the standpoint of U.S. policymakers, human rights has never been at the very top of the agenda vis-a-vis China, but it has always been part of the conversation. And it has become even more part of the conversation in the last few years, in light of China's recent actions, frankly, in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. These have really driven a lot of public and policy discourse about China in the US and in the Western world more generally, in a very broad sense. And these are the issues that, in my view, give the most bite to public and policy discourse in the US about China today. In kind of going over some of the particular issues within this space that we are concerned about in the US, I think it's worth mentioning that there are a set of what I would almost call traditional issues that have been part of the conversation, at least since 1989 and a little bit earlier than that. And those include restrictions of civic space for Chinese activists and Chinese believers, Chinese journalists, Chinese civil society actors in the current political context of China. Another set of concerns has to do with unpredictability in the legal system. And yet another set of concerns has to do with censorship and surveillance, the limitations on speech in China. And all of these issues have frankly seemed to have gotten worse over the past 10 years. But already the trend lines were trending in a direction that seemed to be different from what Western observers of China had hoped for during the heyday of engagement for some years beyond just the past 10 years. Alongside these, what I've called traditional issues, there has long been concern over Chinese efforts to restrict religious practices in Tibet. But especially, I would say, in the last 10 years or so, there is a new level of concern over some newer Chinese actions, including since 2017, the fact that Chinese authorities have put more than 1 million Uyghurs into re-education camps or prisons. This has really seemed to be a new kind of issue, different from the traditional human rights concerns that US observers had. And that is what has driven not only much of the public debate about China and the US, but also particular legislative efforts like the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. At the same time, I think U.S. observers have been concerned about Chinese actions in Hong Kong, especially over the past 5 years, which have seemed to undermine the autonomy that was promised when the United Kingdom returned Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. These steps over the past 5 years, which have included passage of a new national security law, have led to the arrest and prosecution of hundreds of journalists, lawyers, and activists. And then lastly, especially of late, there is a particular concern that has emerged in the US and the West more broadly about China's actions abroad that have seemed to, at a minimum, spread liberal values and then more concretely led to harassment of figures outside of China that China wants to somehow keep undercover. So that's the overall landscape of things that have really caused the political and policy discourse about China's human rights to take a turn in recent years. And I think the big question that would be ideal to discuss in our political campaigns, our political and policy discourse more generally, would be what is the best, most effective way to express disagreement with and even combat these human rights practices which we oppose. And that question would include questions like, what is our actual capacity on the part of the United States to change Chinese behavior within its own borders? And even if that may be limited, what is our responsibility to shine a light on those practices with which we disagree? These are actually pretty complex questions that would ideally be things that we talk about in greater depth and hopefully will in the coming years. But it is easy not to ask them in the ways that I've just presented. And it's easy, I think, sometimes, especially in light of the wider geopolitical competition, to let these issues simply feed into that geopolitical competition as opposed to thinking of them from a mindset of how do we actually think about expressing our values and also trying to create really better practices within the Chinese context. Let me turn next to talk a little bit about trade issues. And of course, Susan mentioned these in her remarks as well. But I think it's important to spend a little bit more time on trade issues, in part because these are the issues that drove what is sometimes called the trade war launched by the Trump administration, which in many, if not most ways, the Biden administration has continued to prosecute, even though there are many ways in which the Biden administration is otherwise perhaps different from the Trump administration. So the core argument from a US perspective on these issues is that Chinese economic growth has too much benefited from the deployment of what we consider to be unfair and harmful trade practices. And these include China's use of subsidies, trade barriers, theft of intellectual property, and forced labor. At this very particular moment today, what I think is becoming a focus of concern is this question of whether China is trying to improve its relatively poor economic outlook at the moment by flooding the international market with cheap goods, relieving its own overcapacity challenges, and effectively killing certain industries elsewhere, such as electrical vehicle markets in Europe and elsewhere. So the US response to that wider set of concerns and to this particular challenge now of China's, using its overcapacity to flood the market with cheap goods, is partly just the continued use of tariffs. And this tariffs is something that the Trump administration really kind of moved the ball forward on. But the Biden administration has not only not reduced any of those tariffs, but has announced even newer tariffs. So this mechanism, which many people thought was sort of antithetical to the US approach to trade and the global economic order, has become a major component of US policy response to China. We also see legislation like the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which in some cases are spurring investments in some sectors to better compete with China, but they're also creating protective barriers that, again, seem somewhat opposed to or antithetical to our traditional American approach to free trade and open markets. As we go forward, the question that ideally we would be discussing in our political discourse and our policy discourse would be, how do we best combat those Chinese trade practices we don't like, while at the same time continuing to reap the benefits of trade with China and preserving the global market generally along the lines that we have traditionally supported? There's a lot of little contradictions within those questions that I've just asked, because there are ways in which our efforts to combat Chinese trade practice might be in tension with our traditional approach to trade. But I'm not sure that we are going to be ventilating these questions as openly and as robustly as we should in the coming election campaign. Hopefully we will down the line. Let me also say a few words about technological competition. In particular, many commentators often talk about whether we are now between the U.S. and China in some kind of a Cold War. There are lots of different views about that, but there does seem to be kind of a consensus, a wide agreement that at least we are in a technological Cold War, a technology Cold War. We are in a Cold War when it comes to the field of technology. And this reflects in part that there are both economic and also national security components to this issue area. Yes, we are worried about competition from Chinese tech companies, but we are also worried about the potential for technological advances to accelerate China's military modernization in ways that we are concerned about. And we're also worried about maybe more abstract ways in which Chinese technology can weaken us in some way. And I think you can see an example of that in the discourse around banning the app TikTok, which of course is related to a Chinese tech company, and our concerns about whether the ability to harvest data from TikTok users in the United States might in some way be deployed in a nefarious way by Chinese authorities. Now, against these challenges, the U.S. strategy has been in large part to try to freeze Chinese advances in certain sectors like semiconductors and artificial intelligence and supercomputing, and also maybe to a lesser extent to try to outmaneuver China in setting rules of the road for the digital economy, including cross-border trade in digital goods and services. These have had, I think, especially the efforts to freeze Chinese advances, have, at least in the short term, had a measurable impact on Chinese technological advances. But the big question, again, that hopefully we can ventilate at some point in the future is whether these kinds of measures are really going to succeed in holding down Chinese innovation in the tech sector. We're already seeing some signs that Chinese innovation is managing to work around the restrictions that we're trying to place on it. And meanwhile, while we're putting some of these restrictions, are we impacting our own ability to innovate in these sectors? These are the hard questions that hopefully we will be ventilating in some way in our coming political and policy discourse, if not necessarily in the coming campaign. Let me also say a few words about China on the global stage. Along with China's economic growth in recent decades and recent years has come an increased assertiveness in the global stage, especially over the past 10 years under Xi Jinping. In part, this is reflected in redoubled efforts by China to court the global South. China has sought to court the global South really since the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party's rule of mainland China. This has always been part of the diplomatic effort by China, but they have put much more money, frankly, and attention and resource into it in the recent years, including, or perhaps especially through efforts like the Belt and Road Initiative, under which China has lent more than $1.3 trillion since 2015, helping to build roads and power plants and all sorts of infrastructure throughout the developing world, and in particular in Central Asia. These are efforts that have been met with a lot of consternation in the U.S. in particular, which has seen it as a way of China expanding its soft power. But we are not really willing to put our own money in play in quite the same way. So China has had an opening in terms of this kind of development assistance. In much the same way, China's assertiveness on the global stage has included a greater degree of involvement in multilateral organizations, really trying to flood the zone with greater representation in multilateral organizations, just as we in the United States in particular have been withdrawing from many of these multilateral organizations, again, giving China an opening there. It's also important to mention that China's increased assertiveness on the global stage has included some healthy degree of economic coercion vis-a-vis parties and countries that it disagrees with. Most famously, perhaps in recent years, has been its actions towards Australia, and then, of course, towards the smaller country in Europe of Lithuania. These steps include measures like restricting market access, manipulating supply chain vulnerabilities, and in general, seeking to throw China's economic weight behind its coercive activities. Now, we can look at China's particular actions vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza on their own terms, of course, and perhaps we should, but I hope we can also look at them within this wider backdrop of competition on the global stage, and in particular, vis-a-vis the global South. I think that's a very important lens with which to understand what China is trying to do in each of these particular instances, whether or not we agree with that. And I think, to again go back to what I think is the big question for U.S. policy and political discourse, the big question is, are we, frankly, up to the challenge that China is posing in these ways? This is a challenge that, frankly, is a lot more subtle and complicated and difficult than the challenge that was posed by our last geopolitical competitor, the former Soviet Union. The way in which China's message resonates in the global South, the way in which China has tried to outmaneuver us in multilateral organizations, frankly, is harder for us to address than some of the ways in which the Soviet Union posed challenges at that time. We are, in some ways, in a moment in our history where we are more inward-looking than we had been in the past, certainly than we were during the height of the Cold War. So it's an open question. Are we up for meeting China on that global stage in the ways that can be most effective in advancing our own approach to geopolitical governance? The last set of issues I want to spend a little bit of time on is sort of in a different mode, but they're issues related to global public goods like climate and health. Because whatever our disputes with and our challenges emanating from China, which I've tried to discuss in some detail in the last few minutes, regardless of all of that, collectively, we are in many ways, on the cusp of a perhaps catastrophic or even existential threat from other sources. We all experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're all aware of the ways in which climate change may be bringing, the water right up to our homes in ways that can potentially be immensely destabilizing. The big question here is simply, is there any possibility that the U.S. and China, notwithstanding all the other things that we're disagreeing on, notwithstanding all the other issues in which we have legitimate concerns, notwithstanding our geopolitical competition, are there ways in which we can work together on these kinds of issues? Can we create, at least on these kinds of issues, a virtuous race to the top, or are we destined to a race to the bottom? I think both possibilities are perhaps extant, but there are some reasons to think that we are maybe more inclined towards a race to the bottom. And for example, we could look at China's dominance in clean energy technologies and supply chains. If we were thinking simply in terms of combating climate change, it's possible that we would lean into China's advantages in those respects and try to deploy China's advantages in those respects in a way that could be of some benefit to trying to combat this wider existential threat. But because there is a very clear economic component to that, we tend to be trying to limit China's dominance in those respects in ways that may not lead to that virtuous race to the top. So there are at least some reasons, concrete reasons, to question whether cooperation on these kinds of issues is really possible given the current moment in U.S.-China relations. So let me stop there. I'm very eager to engage in wider dialogue with Susan and also with our moderator in just a moment. But again, I think that the framework that I'm trying to propose here starts with a realistic, clear-eyed vision that there are things that China is doing across many different subject areas that are of real and genuine concern that we do need to address, but how best to address them, what are the most wise and strategically effective ways to address them. I hope we can have a wider political and policy debate in the coming years, whether in this election campaign or in the future.
Right.
Maybe.
Thank you very much for that. Next up, I think, will be the really exciting segment where Sebastian Cherng, our moderator, who is the Vice Dean of Research and Equity and Associate Professor of International Education at NYU, will help facilitate this particular conversation and get inputs from both speakers on some of the key important issues. So take it away, Sebastian.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Neysun and Susan, for such amazing insight. It was a privilege for me, and I am a China scholar, to hear from not only on the breadth of topics between U.S. and China relationships, but just how the narrative, right? I feel like, although we did not really coordinate, there was a similar narrative, right, of U.S.-China relations, not just being a topic of interest, but a topic of necessity and urgency, right, particularly for teachers, right? And so here, the 1990 Institute posed 3 polls, right, and to kind of summarize, maybe not the most surprising that the vast majority, actually I think every single respondent, to the question of, do you believe that U.S.-China relations shape the lives of people in the United States, of Asian Americans? Almost, actually all of you said yes, right? And I think that that's actually a pretty good entree into kind of the classroom, right? That U.S.-China relations is not something that is very external, right? It's not just how we interact with a country across on the other side of the world, but how it actually affects potentially students in our own classroom, right? Here, I just want to pick up on Susan. You gave such an amazing history and portrait of how the U.S. and China, our histories are intertwined, right? You talked about kind of the earliest ways of immigration from China to the U.S. to build the railroads, starting by coastal in New York, where I am, in San Francisco on the other end, and how that immediately affected U.S. Immigration policies, in particular, naming kind of one of the most original named racist policies of the China Exclusion Act, right? The first time in U.S. policy where an actual nation/ethnicity/race was named, right? And it was to exclude. You mentioned this term yellow peril, right? Which I just wanted to expand upon a little bit more, since my own work builds quite a bit on this notion that we cannot see Chinese people as anything but competition, right? And this is intertwined with another notion of forever foreign, right? That even if you look at the descendants of Chinese Americans that came over in the 1800s that have been in the United States more than 60% of white Americans, that we will still see them, right, as being recent immigrants, as having surprisingly amazing English, all these things. So I think one of the points that I wanted to point out was just that rivalry seems to not end in good things, and not just in terms of, Neysun, I will borrow and steal your phrase, the virtuous race to the top or the race to the bottom, right? That it really can cause harm to people in the United States, right? And so the first question I wanted to pose to both of you is, I think, as a former middle school classroom teacher, right, and I would say that the majority of respondents, when we pose the question, do you talk or have you talked recently about U.S. and China in a contemporary fashion, that the majority of you said no, right? But this doesn't mean that China is not mentioned in the classroom, right? So to the teacher who has a student who evokes China in a kind of rivalry way, right? And I should also mention that the overwhelming majority of participants, you were most interested in geopolitical rivalry, right, as a topic, right? Which is just very convenient that both of our panelists spent the majority of their time talking about this. What advice would you give to the teacher, right? A teacher hears a student that says, oh, China, like China's going to take over, right? China's going to do this. What would you say as an even-handed response to these students? Susan, I'll pivot to you first.
You know, ask them sort of why they are saying that, or where they heard that, or what kind of context they have, or what kind of reference they have to say that, because I like to sort of find out where they're coming from first. But I mean, I think, you know, once you can sort of hear from them where it's coming from, I think you can also bring up other aspects of, I mean, China is such a complicated, you know, country. It touches on almost every possible thing you can think of in your life in some way. And so bringing up sort of alternative threads from China that would be relevant to that student's life might be a way of sort of broadening out the perspective on from competition. I mean, I think it is very easy to be othering and to try to, you know, place all of our thinking about China in this context of, you know, black and white, you know, rivalrous kinds of themes. But I think there are a lot of other angles to it that people see. I mean, there's so many things in sort of the arts and culture and, you know, that are around us all the time, every day. And so bringing up sort of counter examples is one way of doing it, I suppose.
Susan? Neysun, what are your thoughts?
The first thought that came to my mind was, you know, if a student was to ask a teacher, you know, a question along the lines you posed, I think it offers a moment, you know, as they say, a teachable moment, right? Because this is not, I will say, the first time in American history that we have been concerned in these terms, right? In fact, we seem to kind of fall through these cycles on a fairly recurrent basis with respect to lots of different parts of the world. And I think situating the current moment against that wider context can be helpful. Now, that is not to say that we have never had reason to be concerned about different parts of the world. I often like to joke that oftentimes paranoid people have a reason to be paranoid. So it's not that it's completely random, but the overreaction that maybe has occurred at different moments in history is one that is recurrent. And so I think, you know, an educator can kind of place that context nicely for a student who's interested in this particular existential threat that they seem to pick up on in the news and in other commentary.
Thank you. And I mean, my own 2 cents. I really appreciated the idea, the notion of kind of green tech, right? Where Susan, you said that China is the largest polluter in the world, right? Some of this it's also the largest population, or I think now exceeded by India, but you know, before this year,
Right.
the largest population, most populous country in the world, but also it is a leader in the world of green tech, right? And so this idea that, and maybe even as teachers supposed to students, right, is, I mean, I think it is not really that controversial to say, okay, we probably can do a better job of taking care of our environment, right? China has technology that is really it surpasses in many ways the US in terms of cleaner ways, right, of doing things. So what should we do? Right? Should we collaborate with them? Should we learn from them? And I feel like this is kind of this seemingly neutral entryway into this topic of what should collaboration be, right? And then maybe at the end of it saying, well, there's some collaboration, but there's also a lot of competition, right? And it's not necessarily just an economic competition, like the US wants to make the most off of green technology, but this kind of a broader idea that China is a rival, right? So if it eclipses anything, right, of the US, that this is bad, but this actually could harm not just our 2 nations, but the world, right? Neysun, you mentioned TikTok very briefly, right? And I would be remiss if I didn't revisit this idea, because this is something that is fortunately or unfortunately very near and dear to many of our students' hearts, right? And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more of, this is actually probably a very common way that students would bring up China, right? And interestingly, I think that in the news, right, the way that TikTok is being described is it's a security issue, right? And you started to talk about how TikTok it's a tool for cultural influence, right? And that this is as much, if not even more, of a concern for the U.S. of why it wants to ban the platform. But for the teacher who hears a student is like, oh my God, I heard that like we can't use TikTok soon, and it's because it's like a spying software. What would your response be, or how would you help that teacher?
I mean, that's a complicated issue. And I think, frankly, when I think about the TikTok issue, I am mindful that most, if not all, the apps that I rely on in the U.S. context are not allowed in China. Right. So when I go to China, I can't use Google. I can't use Facebook. I can't use Twitter. So, this idea that somehow it is, deeply unfair to ban this one Chinese app in the U.S. against that wider context, I don't really take much stock in that. I do wonder about, what is our approach? Is our approach the same as the Chinese approach? Do we ban things we don't like in the way that the Chinese do? Do we want to advance a different kind of approach? I mean, I do think about that. That has traditionally been our approach. Like we do it our way. We don't do things the Chinese way. But at the same time, like TikTok, if we think of it as almost like a national media platform, there aren't a lot of countries that give their national media platform over to their geopolitical adversaries. That's just not a common thing. So that's a lot of complexity to reduce for, a 13-year-old who's unhappy they don't have TikTok, but it is that kind of an issue. There's not a simple answer to it.
I love this idea of, and I have actually not even heard this in kind of the U.S. media coverage of, well, if we ban TikTok, that's just like what China does to us, right? That's not the rationale that that I've heard of, right? But it is exactly like you said, right? It's you do this and I do this, and I don't think many people in the U.S., especially kind of in the political realm, would be like, oh yeah, no, we love adopting Chinese ways of addressing the no way, right? And to pose that to students, saying like, wow, it's interesting. We may actually do the same thing that other nations do with a different rationale, but at the end of the day, the behavior is the same, right? Another kind of realm of competition.
I don't interrupt you, Sebastian, but I'd love to hear what Susan has to say about that, because
sure.
I am curious about her views.
Yeah, I mean, I find that the discussion of TikTok in the US is confusing, and I really liked, Neysun, how you went through all of your issues and then said, so what are the kind of threshold or principle questions that we should be asking about, how we're dealing with these questions, and we should have a rational explanation. It feels a little bit on TikTok and so many other things related to China that we're just kind of knee-jerk response, China bad, and we aren't really thinking through, as you said, sort of the use case, the base case, the principles that we want to use to approach future cases. And it seems all very kind of haphazard and inefficient to me. And so I would really like there to be a lot more thoughtful approaches to sort of regulation of technology for minors. And I mean, I'm also a little bit unhappy about the discussion of influence, because I mean, I feel like every single platform and every single advertiser in every country is trying to influence all of us all the time. And frankly, we're doing the same thing. We're trying to influence other people. So, where is influence crossing the line into something nefarious? Where is the line where I can't decide for myself what kind of influences I want to be subjected to and not, and make up my own mind about how I feel about them? And so I'm a little bit worried about the creeping state involvement in deciding who can be allowed to try to influence me versus who can't. I mean, I'm just a bit, that makes me uncomfortable. So I haven't really come up with the answer yet, but I know that I have a lot of qualms about a lot of these things.
And if I could just add one small point to this, I think it is important on the particular issue of TikTok and children that we understand that a lot of parents are supportive of this ban because of wider concerns about their children's use of technology. And that is, I think a very fair concern to have. And I think it's fueling, if the 13-year-old were to say, hey, I may be losing my TikTok, you should tell them, hey, you might be losing your phone entirely, kid, right? Like we may not want you to be using anything on a phone for a few more years. But like the way that Susan said, I think it would be helpful to try to like cabin our wider concerns about, all sorts of social media apps away from kind of the particular kind of like anti-Chinese element that goes into some of the discussion around TikTok.
I often wonder if TikTok, I would imagine, before TikTok, there were other social media platforms that were just as popular, maybe, or were popular, maybe not as just popular TikTok, but the ire towards TikTok that the US and many politicians have, like how that is likely magnified because it has Chinese connections, right? Which would be also an interesting way of posing it to students, right? Saying, okay, this is not the only, like Snapchat, which again, I am way too old to use any of these tech platforms, but Snapchat to me seems incredibly unsavory and has a very obvious use where you're like, that's not great, right? But there were no like federal policies proposing banning Snapchat, right? And I think that's kind of an interesting way of talking to students about this too, right? Although I imagine, again, students will probably be very upset that TikTok may disappear, right? Not that it should be enforced more. Maybe I'm wrong. But another example of kind of this competition, right? And another way that it manifests is actually through educational exchange, right? In terms of kind of educational diplomacy, the US and China actually have some of the longest histories of saying, we will take our best and brightest to send to you and we'll take yours, right? And that education is a way of having kind of a very meaningful, if not a large number, but a meaningful exchange. Can you both give us kind of this, just maybe a brief overview of what's happening to educational exchange in US and China and how it's tied to the relations?
Well,
Neysun,
I know that, I know that
Susan,
Neyson's done a lot of work on this, but I just do have to brag on being at Yale because we had the first Chinese student graduate from a US university. So I have to sneak that in before he gets to talk.
And very, very impactful. So Young Wing in the 1870s, the first Chinese graduate from Yale, convinces the very conservative Qing government to send some of its best and brightest young students to Hartford, Connecticut, to then disperse through a lot of New England colleges. It's this incredible, incredible story. And I think so. I have a more sort of connectivity to it now because I just taught this class on the history of U.S.-China relations and learned much more details about all of this. And to be totally honest, it sort of put my mind a little bit to ease about the current complexities in U.S.-China educational exchange, both because the history is so long. This is not something that just started in 1979. The history goes back to the Yale graduate, Young Wing, in the 1870s, but has had all sorts of, ebbs and flows in those 150 years since. When I was reading about how the conservative Qing officials were concerned that their best and brightest students were becoming too Americanized in the United States because, God forbid, they were cutting off their pigtails and learning to play baseball. It made me think like, nothing is really new. There's the same types of, concerns around these kinds of dynamics are recurrent all throughout history. But yes, this current moment, we are at an odd moment, an ebb. Some of that is obviously as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the COVID-19 pandemic kind of caught a wave of the decline in U.S.-China relations So they kind of mutually reinforce each other to the point where even though we are now at least a year, a little longer since the relaxation of the COVID restrictions in China, we are still nowhere near the resumption of at least American students going over to China that we were used to in the past. We do seem to have kind of bounced back in terms of Chinese students coming to the US. That isn't to say there are no concerns there, but more or less that seems to have bounced in a positive way back to sort of pre-pandemic levels. But American students in China is at the moment, the number that I keep hearing is roughly about 800 American students in China, against the backdrop of, some years ago, it was well over 10, 11,000 American students. Our political leaders, our Secretary of State, our ambassador to Beijing, they all say in very explicit terms that America's future competition with China depends on Americans knowing something about China, and American students should go back to China and learn the language and get on the ground experience. But we're not seeing it happen yet. And I think for a lot of us, including political figures, but including educators, we have a lot of concern about that.
If I may put a modern humble brag on this, so NYU is actually the #1 recipient of Chinese international students. Although some of that is also because we're the largest private school, but still, right? So I'm glad that our institutions that we represent
We're worthy successors to Young Wing and the Chinese educational mission.
Yes.
200 years later and on the other side. I imagine that many of the audience members, because I think, given the topic, given the responses that so many of you are so interested in U.S.-China relations, may find it a little bit difficult to kind of work in the topic, right, in normal classroom teaching or the everyday classroom teaching. I know that the 1990 Institute has identified kind of the common standards, which are not adopted by half the states in the United States, but that there is a component of U.S.-China relations, right? But both of you mentioned, right, that U.S.-China relations, it's not, again, just about these two countries, but that the relationships that the U.S. forms with China can also inform how the U.S. forms and understands other countries, right, in its relationships with other contexts, right? So I guess when I say U.S.-China relations and its relation and how it influences how the U.S. interacts with other nations, right, what immediately jumps to mind?
I would say that, China talks all the time in its official language and also in discourse in the global stage about the fact that China is the largest developing country in the world. Now, I mentioned in my remarks that China is getting very close to being a high-income country, but that's due to the prowess with which it's gone about its development mission. And it really does seem to be focused on this development mission elsewhere in the world. And so I think when we hear about China's relating and reaching out to the rest of the world, it's always doing so through this kind of economic lens. And you often see that the US ends up kind of talking about its relationships with other countries in terms of alliances and security partnerships, its security umbrella. And so I think that makes it, a lot of countries in the world, I think, see their sort of economic bread being buttered with China and their security, kind of partnerships being satisfied by their relations with the United States. And so that is a very sort of interesting thing for teachers and students to think about, and how that kind of evolves in the world going forward. And this is why I think you see China having, as opposed to the Soviet Union in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was very focused on sort of military power and hard power and coercive power. And China has, certainly a huge military, and it does pose threats to some of its neighbors. We've seen outbreaks of conflicts on the border with India, for example. Recently, we've seen incidents with the Philippines, but really the Chinese diplomacy is much more focused on the economic element, and in reaching out to the developing world, much more focused on the sort of development narrative.
Neysun, any thoughts?
Your question is really like China's relations with other countries?
Or how does U.S.-China relations influence the relationships that U.S. forms with other countries, right? Like another entree working in U.S.-China relations in a conversation that may have seemingly nothing to do about China.
And I think the only thing I'd then add is just that, the U.S.-China relationship, we often say, is the most important bilateral relationship for each of those countries. But I also think it just sets sort of the global stage in a way that every other country, every other region has to react to. So, U.S.-China relations is a driving force in what is being discussed in European capitals and other Asian capitals, throughout the global South. And I think each of these different countries and regions are kind of coming up with calculuses that are somewhat different. And I definitely agree with Susan that there are some of them that are sort of taking this kind of bifurcated approach, taking the U.S., security guarantees, and then maybe taking the Chinese economic potential. Then there are also some countries, our friends Sheena Greitens and Isaac Hardin have talked about how there are certain countries that maybe for their domestic security are looking for like ideas from China, but for their kind of international relations security are looking for security guarantees from the U.S. So there's lots of mix and match there. I do think that it goes back to something I said at the end of my own remarks. We have to be very clear that the challenge that China poses in this respect is not, it's not as easily cabined as the challenge that the Soviet Union posed. And we see that especially in the global South, where, just a simple example of, we go to a country and say, you shouldn't take the Belt and Road funding because you might get, stuck in a debt relationship. And they say, okay, well, are you offering funding? And we say, no, we don't do that. We just think you shouldn't take that money. We got to get a little bit more sophisticated if we really care about kind of competing with China on this global stage.
Great answer right there. One thing that I think is very common in media coverage of China is something that actually I'm not even sure if this word was mentioned, but this idea of communism, right? And I think this is something that among maybe the younger people, there's the student generation, there's less of that in the conversation, but like in the case, right, that communism is discussed or brought up, right? What tips would you give to teachers about talking about this loaded term?
Where did Susan go? I need Susan to answer the communism question.
She's
sorry, I'm back.
Yeah, Susan, you're going to take the communism question.
The communism
I missed it.
question.
What was the communism question?
So I think communism is a very loaded term when uttered in the United States and in a classroom, right? If either a teacher or another teacher or a student talks about China as a communism, with kind of this look, right? What would be a well-rounded response to that student or even a colleague? Communism as the boogie.
Yeah.
I gotta go now. So nice chatting with you guys. Have a good lunch.
I often wonder, do middle school students still bring up communism? I grew up with it, but I'm of a certain age, and I just wondered if it still means something to people. I guess it sort of is used as a kind of an epithet, maybe in some politically tinged conversations still in the United States, but it seems like it would be a very tough thing for a middle school student to bring up with any kind of background. You could give him the tome of Karl Marx Capital and tell him to read it and come back later and give a report on what exactly communism is, because I bet that there's very little understanding there. But I think, and there's the other side, which is, why is China called, communist at this point? It's very, it's very kind of strange to see what looks to be an economy that's capitalist on steroids, so uber competitive that, you know, people are just you know, cutting each other's you know, margins left and right to try to win market share, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's just such a competitive and sort of capitalistic form of existence in China right now in its economy. I mean, certainly there's a lot of state ownership, but maybe that's a way to sort of pursue it, is that, say, you know, communism, you know, refers to this sort of traditional form of an economy, which has kind of really changed in many ways in China and gone away from its original meaning. I mean, then the question is, why is the Chinese Communist Party still called the Chinese Communist Party? That's one that I've asked my Chinese colleagues, and you should see their hair stand on end. So I think, you know, you could you could say that it's kind of a tradition or something. It's a name that's stuck and can't be changed. But I don't really know. Neysun, you give a shot there.
The only thing I'll add is, you know, like, sure, you could have a deep conversation with a 13-year-old about kind of Karl Marx and the, you know, the theory of capital and the ways in which, you know, Mao appropriated communism for his own purposes and Deng Xiaoping, you know, like, you could have that conversation and maybe, you know, that could yield something. But, you know, I think the other point here is there is, I think, in our political discourse, this effort sometimes to kind of create this sort of what we think of as a useful acoustic separation between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people, so that it enables us to, like, say all these bad things about the Chinese Communist Party, but say, oh, but we're not saying them about the Chinese people. To be totally honest, I understand why people think in those terms. At the end of the day, this is the government of China. This is, you know, a government that, you know, when we try to create this acoustic separation, are we basically saying that we are actively engaging in regime change efforts or something like that? Like, I think it can just take us down, and it can kind of put like this, you know, this sense of like, you know, for example, like one of my good friends, Professor He Weifeng, is one of the great public intellectuals and liberal legal figures of the last 30, 40 years. He was just profiled in the South China Morning Post. And he says explicitly, I am still a member of the Chinese Communist Party, right? Like he does not think of himself as like, oh, like there's like the bad CCP and I'm, you know, like, I think it's a much more complex relationship. And so if we fall into this trap of just kind of trying to create, it's not like, you know, like I think we're not used to this idea that whatever, and I think there are lots of things to be critical about the Chinese Communist Party. Please don't get me wrong, like lots and lots of things. But this idea that like, oh, there's all these Chinese people who are just like waiting for the instant to like overthrow the government, and all we need to do is like just, you know, say a few nice things and like suddenly that's going to happen. Like that, it goes back to my initial point about we need to be wise in our approach to this challenge, and not fall into simplistic thinking. And if that means developing some level of comfort with, you know, the governing party in China being called the Chinese Communist Party, that seems to me smarter than like falling into the trap of pretending that we can, like, you know, just kind of demonize this one thing and not have it bleed over into the way we talk about the people in the country.
Good point. The final question, and such a lighthearted, easy question. So what is the long-term goal for U.S.-China relations, particularly in terms of the U.S.'s strategic goals? The long game.
Yeah, well, this is a really tough question, and I think it's one that, as Neysun was putting it in all the list of questions that he was talking about, you know, it's one that we haven't really talked about in terms of any kind of discussion of this 180-degree change in our China policy, what it is that it's trying to actually accomplish. It feels more like a kind of a a belated sort of panic attack over China progressing in a way that, you know, many people find to be unexpected, but which actually a lot of people very much did expect. So, and so now we're sort of responding, and it feels like it's a lot of haphazard knee-jerk responses, which are not really well thought through in terms of strategy or aimed at anything concerted. I mean, my view, and it fits with what I was talking about in terms of China's impact on almost everything having to do with all of our daily lives, because its scale is so huge and the planet is getting much, much smaller. I mean, for me, I would hope that China would take up, you know, a very responsible position in managing global affairs in order to contribute to a lot of the burdens that the U.S. is currently bearing almost, you know, single-handedly. And, you know, some people would say not doing very well if you look around at sort of what's going on in the world today. I mean, we need to have China as a major player and a very large and capable power, you know, and the government in China does have a lot of capacity. We need to get that capacity channeled into directions that are going to help us to maintain, you know, a semblance of order, peace, and security, and you know, continued development in the world, and continued health and environmental, you know, health in the world. And so I that's what I would hope to see, that we can work with China in a way that moves it in the direction so that we can, you know, work on these global challenges together, because I think these are going to be the major issues that are going to, I think AI, health concerns, and the environment are going to be, you know, along with economic concerns, which China is a huge player on as well. Those are going to be the things that really challenge us in the coming years, and affect every single person in the United States' life in very significant ways.
You know, I'll just add that I think there are a lot of people in kind of this China watching community that me and Susan are part of, who have really, I think, come to a point where they have very, very limited expectations, and the most they can hope for in the relationship is that we don't go to war. So they feel as long as we don't go to war, it's a win. That's the bottom line that we should be aiming for. I tend to have more ambitious goals than that, and much in the same vein that Susan was just outlining. I hope for a more collaborative relationship. You know, many years ago, I guess at the time he would have been the Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zoellick, gave this speech about China as a responsible stakeholder, which many people kind of like look at now and say, oh, you know, that was hopelessly naive, or, you know, other kinds of critiques. But I still think that vision, you know, maybe we can kind of update it for the present day, but that broader vision is the ideal goal. You know, I think if there is some pathway towards that, that's better than just saying, oh, we didn't go to war with one another. I think, frankly, a lot of people in our kind of political and policy establishment think that vision is hopelessly naive and unrealistic, but I still hold on to that. And I think maybe based on what she just said, maybe Susan does too. That just seems to be, you know, there's a lot more good that can come out of that than just avoiding war. But I think we have to be realistic that there's a long way to go before we can achieve that kind of a vision.
Thanks, Neysun.
Yeah, we want the students and the future leaders of tomorrow to have a higher bar than just not go to war.
Wow, that was a lot of information. Thank you, Sebastian, for moderating and navigating through this complex issue. And of course, Neysun and Susan, you know, we couldn't have a better group of speakers to help us go through this program. We've covered a lot of grounds, and we hope this workshop provides a framework and foundation material for you to bring back to the classroom. As you return to the classroom, use the resources we've introduced, our newsletters, our reference library, and the teacher's portal to stay informed and bring these discussions to life. Let's continue to inspire and educate together. Have a wonderful summer, and we look forward to seeing you at the next workshop in the fall, which will focus on Asian American identity and the impact of immigration on our society and our community. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.